Russia called it terrorism. The numbers say something else. On July 14th, Russia's own foreign minister stood in front of a room full of cameras and lost his composure on live television. Sergei Lavrov was meeting with Chad's foreign minister in Moscow. A journalist asked him about Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian shipping. Lavrov didn't just answer the question. He said what Ukraine was doing wasn't even piracy, because pirates at least steal for themselves. He called it pure terrorism. Here's what makes that moment strange. Lavrov never mentioned that Russia has hit dozens of civilian merchant ships since the war began, including grain vessels bound for hungry markets. He accused Ukraine of terrorizing shipping while leaving his own government's record on shipping completely out of the conversation. Less than a day later, the answer came. Not from Kiev's foreign ministry, from the commander who was actually running the strikes. Robert Madyar Brovdy posted on Telegram, "No piracy, Lavrov, just business." And buried in that same post was the real story. Brovdy confirmed his forces had just hit 20 more Russian ships. Not in the sea everyone had been talking about, in a completely different sea, on a completely different coastline. So how did a foreign minister end up losing his cool over a war that, a month earlier, most people outside the region had never heard of? The sea Russia thought it owned. Rewind 9 days. On July 6th, Ukraine's unmanned systems forces launched an operation with an oddly gentle name, Molochka, which roughly translates to dairy products. Nothing about what followed was gentle. Night after night, drones returned to the Sea of Azov, the shallow body of water tucked behind Crimea that Russia has treated as its own private lake since 2022. By July 14th, Brovdy's own count put the total at 116 vessels struck in 9 nights. On the single heaviest night, July 10th into the 11th, 28 ships were hit at once. Here's the part that matters more than any single number. The Sea of Azov averages only about 7 meters deep. That's too shallow for the giant tankers Russia relies on to move oil out to the world. So Russia built a workaround, a fleet of small, flat-bottomed feeder tankers that shuttle oil from river ports out to the bigger ships waiting offshore. Brovdy calls them the worker camels of the sea, unglamorous, constantly moving. And now, constantly on fire. Russia didn't wait to be forced into a response. On July 10th, for the first time in the entire war, Moscow suspended shipping through the Don Azov Canal and stopped letting vessels through the Kerch Strait. Nobody sanctioned that decision. Russia made it because its own sea had become too dangerous for its own ships. The ripple reached grocery shelves almost instantly. Wheat futures on the Euronext exchange jumped roughly 4% within days, because a real slice of Russian grain exports normally moves through exactly this route. A handful of drones hitting boats in a sea most people had never thought about had just moved a global commodity price. Which raises the obvious question. How did Russia leave itself this exposed? The mistake hiding in plain sight. 3:45, 6 o'clock. For years, Western sanctions chased Russia's big ocean-going tankers, the ones crossing the Atlantic toward buyers in Asia. The EU built a list of over 600 vessels. Britain boarded one in the English Channel. France seized another, leaving a Russian port. It barely worked. As of this spring, researchers at the Kiev School of Economics estimated roughly 3/4 of Russian crude was still moving through this shadow fleet, on ships averaging over 15 years old. So, Russia adjusted. To dodge Western boarding crews, it began reflagging Shadow Fleet ships under its own flag instead of shell company registrations. Between May 2025 and April 2026, the share of Shadow Fleet oil moving under the Russian flag jumped from 3% to 23%. It looked like protection. It was the opposite. Under the San Remo Manual, the body of international law governing naval warfare, a vessel flying an enemy flag while carrying cargo that funds that enemy's war effort isn't a legal gray area. It's a legitimate military target. A ship hiding behind a Panama registration creates confusion about who owns it. A ship flying Russia's own flag, hauling Russia's own oil, removes that confusion entirely. Russia had spent nearly a year painting a target onto its own fleet. and the weapon waiting for that target had just gotten sharper. Defense analyst Roy Gardner identified it as the FP2, a Ukrainian-built strike drone from the manufacturer Firepoint. At June's Paris Air Show, Firepoint unveiled an upgraded version carrying a 200-kilogram warhead out to roughly 370 kilometers, guided in its final approach by a human operator watching a live camera feed. According to reporting on the company's output, Firepoint is now producing around 300 of these drones a day. This wasn't one lucky raid. It was a factory floor turned into a sustained campaign. Ukraine's security service ran a parallel track with an entirely different weapon, a surface-skimming naval drone called Sea Baby, striking tankers near Yalta the same week. Two separate Ukrainian institutions, two different weapons, hunting the same fleet on the same timeline. Satellite data backs up what the drone footage suggested. Tracking from ISW's Starboard Maritime Intelligence showed 267 vessels broadcasting location in the Sea of Azov on June 30th. By July 11th, that number had fallen to roughly 120. Independent researchers at Poland's OSW Center urged caution on exact damage figures, but the pattern was undeniable. A sea Russia once called safe emptied out in under 2 weeks. So Russian ships fled toward the Black Sea, and on July 15th, marking Ukrainian Statehood Day, Borodvy's forces followed them there, hitting 20 vessels in a single night. 2 fronts, 1 week. By July 17th, less than 2 weeks into the operation, Borodvy's tally across both seas had climbed past 150 vessels. The campaign hadn't slowed down. It had grown a second front. And it wasn't only about ships. On the night of July 13th into the 14th, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces struck the Gazprom Neftekhim Salavat refinery in Bashkortostan, over 1,300 kilometers from the front line, working with an internal resistance network called Chernaya Iskra, or Black Spark. Salavat was the last major gasoline-producing refinery in Russia that hadn't already been hit this year. Satellite images 2 days later showed the strike had reached both of its primary distillation units. The same night, a second refinery in Krasnodar was hit as well. Russia's own regional officials tried to downplay it, insisting the facility would be back to normal within days. Russia's agriculture ministry insisted grain exports wouldn't be affected, even as the canal that carries a quarter of those exports sat closed by Russia's own order. The real question isn't whether this campaign keeps going. It's how much of Russia's coastline is left that these drones haven't reached yet.